Bear was not his given name. He had been born Elias McKinley, in a small town perched at the edge of a great forest. But from a young age, he preferred to wander into the woods more than any of his friends. When he discovered how large his footprints were compared to other boys, and realized how comfortable he felt among the trees, one of his buddies playfully started calling him Bear. Over time, no one remembered precisely who had coined the nickname or when. The name simply fit him like the battered boots he wore for every hike, heavy, reliable, and always ready for an unexpected journey. Now in his mid-30s, Bear had come to Yosemite National Park in the hopes of pulling himself back from the slow unraveling he felt in his life. His nights had grown sleepless, filled with a quiet sense of unease that would not yield. The park had always been a symbol of grandeur and possibility, half-frozen waterfalls that thundered down granite cliffs, mighty ancient sequoias standing as guardians in groves older than recorded history. This was a place of rest and challenge all at once. Perhaps it would also be a place of renewal. A few days before, Bear had arrived at Yosemite's North Pines campground, not far from the Merced River, which cut its path through the heart of the valley. Even in the shoulder season, the place was alive with the sound of swirling water and the chatter of birds weaving their songs among tall evergreens. He chose a secluded campsite set back from the main path, where he could open his tent flap in the morning and see the silhouette of Half Dome etched against the skyline. The plan had been simple enough: pitch his tent, spend a few nights under the stars, reconnect with the wilderness, and maybe find whatever elusive piece had been slipping between the cracks of his daily routine. He packed the essentials: a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of cedar from last summer's adventures, a small cooking stove, a bag of provisions, a battered journal he had carried since college, and a camera to capture any fleeting moment of wonder. Yet on the first night, Bear couldn't shake a strange disquiet. Long after twilight settled, he sat by the dying embers of a fire, feeling as if every problem he had tried to leave behind, troubles at work, an uncertain future, the memory of a failed relationship, had followed him into these hallowed grounds. Instead of gazing in awe at the star-speckled sky, he felt weighed down by something within himself, as though fear had quietly joined him by the fire. Silent and persistent, he ended up crawling into his tent well past midnight, tired, but not in a restful way. The morning sun found him awake and unable to move from the quiet prison of his thoughts. The sense of disquiet from the night before had hardened into something almost tangible. It pressed on his chest, the way a pack would dig into his back after miles of strenuous hiking. Outside his tent, day broke bright and clear, but Bear felt unable to greet it. Instead, he slipped on a flannel jacket and unzipped the tent door just enough to see the faint glimmer of light that dusted the pines. As though it might coax him out of his solitude, he grabbed his small camp stool and sat in front of the tent. The zipper remained half closed behind him. Even that fraction of openness felt like an intrusion. Bear didn't fully understand why he hesitated, why stepping away from the tent, away from this small circle of ground, felt like crossing into unknown territory. He reminded himself, I came here for this exposure, reflection, growth, but he couldn't shake the heaviness. Hour one dragged by, in silence. The morning was breathtaking. The Merced River twinkled in the distance. A hawk circled overhead, wings outstretched, scanning the forest below with a single-minded focus. Bear envied the effortless glide of that hawk, the possibility of riding the wind, free from all that weighed him down. He tried to summon some sense of gratitude. Here he was, sitting at the doorstep of a place people traveled thousands of miles to behold, and yet he was suffocating under his own anxiety. He sipped instant coffee from a tin mug, forcing warmth into his body. It was early October, the air crisp and swirling with a hint of winter. The spires of granite glowed in the new sunlight. Even from a distance, Half Dome looked imposing and wise, like an ancient giant that refused to crumble. Bear allowed himself to marvel at it. If it had been any other year, he would have laced up his boots at sunrise daypack slung over his shoulder, bounding with energy to trek the mist trail or push deeper into the wilderness. But today, he felt anchored in place. By hour 2, Bear's coffee had gone cold, and so had his spirit. Why am I so stuck? The thought repeated with every shallow breath. He tried closing his eyes, imagining the calm that meditation was supposed to bring. He had read in an outdoor magazine how extended solitude in nature could give you clarity and strength. He expected the voices of doubt to subside, but they only grew clearer in the hush. They told him about all the times he'd dared to hope and had fallen short. They recounted every misstep in his life, from botched presentations at work to arguments with his now estranged father. Bear's head grew heavy. He inhaled deeply, letting the forest air fill his lungs, then exhaled slowly and deliberately, one breath at a time. Maybe, if he peeled back enough layers, he could reach the small flame of courage he used to feel about his future. Hour 3 brought subtle changes in the environment. The morning's golden glow faded into a sharper light, illuminating every crease of the tent, every pebble in the ground. More birds sang from the treetops. Squirrels scurried across the forest floor, rummaging for pine cones. In that interval, Bear fumbled with his battered journal, but found no words to write. He told himself to be patient. Reflection wasn't a sprint. He let himself dwell on memories, the boy who wandered the forest near his childhood home, who used to climb the highest branches just to see the horizon. That boy had believed in possibility. Sometimes Bear felt he'd lost the ability to dream. But sitting there, letting the forest remind him of his roots, he felt flickers of that old hope. An ember glowed somewhere in the ash of his spirit, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. At hour 4, 2 hikers walked past the edge of his campsite. They waved politely, then drifted on. Bear couldn't remember the last time he had truly smiled at a stranger. He felt a pang of guilt. The hikers were exploring the wonders he was ignoring. He was here, apparently paralyzed by an anxious dread. As he watched them vanish down the trail, he envied their sense of purpose, how they moved with intention, rucksacks hitting their backs with each jaunty step. He wanted that purpose again. Time meandered into hour 5, and Bear let his eyes wander, soaking in the area. A couple of ranger trucks drove on a dirt road in the distance, stirring dust motes that glimmered in the midday sun. Overhead, the sky was a deep, unwavering blue, the sort of color that made him think of endless potential. The gentle breeze made the pines sway, as if they were greeting the sky in a rhythmic dance. The mesmerizing motion lulled Bear into a near meditative state. He remembered one of the actual bears he had encountered on a different trip, near the east entrance of Yosemite on Tioga Road, rummaging through an open dumpster. How people gathered in hushed amazement to watch the wild creature. He recalled the fleeting terror that the bear might charge, but the moment passed, and the animal ambled away, as though humans were barely worth noting. In that memory, Bear admired the creature's calm presence in its own domain. That beast belonged here, one with the soil, the water, the trees. As the hours dragged on, a quiet transformation began in Bear. Every now and then, his chest would loosen. He'd catch a snippet of a bird call or a rustle in the underbrush, and for a split second, he would feel a sense of connection, not only with his surroundings, but with the possibility that he was part of something larger. For so long, he'd carried a sense of isolation, as though the weight of the world rested solely on him. But in the forest, everything was so obviously linked, each tree root twisting across the ground, each small bird perched on a bough, each gentle exhalation of wind. The forest was alive and communal. It existed in harmony, each creature with a role, each link in a vast chain. Mid-afternoon light poured in, highlighting motes of dust and bits of pollen drifting in the sunbeams. The forest floor came alive in that warm glow. Bear looked out, and for the first time that day, his clenched fists relaxed. He placed his journal on his lap, opened it, and wrote a single sentence: "I am here." 3 simple words, but it felt momentous to bear. He read them aloud, and his voice startled him in the hush. The act of acknowledging his presence, literally and metaphorically, felt like the first step in facing what had locked him in place. "I am here," he repeated, softer this time. "I am here." The words seemed to ground him in the present moment. By hour 6, evening was drawing near, and the shadows lengthened across the campsite. Bear noticed his stomach growling. He had barely eaten that day. The forest was shifting, the daytime creatures making way for the nocturnal ones. But there was still time. A deeper hush settled, as if the world was preparing for dusk's arrival. A gentle exhalation before the night. He unzipped the tent fully now, rummaging for his camp stove, but paused. He realized that stepping beyond the front flap to set up his stove felt like crossing a threshold. He had spent nearly the entire day on that small stool. The first step was the hardest. It always was. Why am I so afraid? He was not physically in danger. He recognized that his fear was intangible, a fear of failure, of stepping into a future that was uncertain, of not being enough. But the small camp stove needed lighting, and that was the simple, tangible next step. He stood, the stool scraping against the gravel as he pushed it aside, and took a single pace away from the tent. He exhaled. A wave of relief coursed through him, as though he had broken a spell. The weight that had compressed his chest gave way, replaced by a hum of possibility. His legs felt stiff, and he stumbled slightly, as if the ground underfoot had just shifted. He set up his stove at a makeshift table, brushing away small twigs. Evening air tasted cleaner, richer, as if awarding him for his courage to stand. Perhaps it was the day's reflection, perhaps it was the hush of nature, but he felt something shift inside. When he finally lit his stove and heated up a simple meal of dehydrated chili, the smell drifted into the cool air. He imagined he could taste every spice more intensely than ever before. Each mouthful felt like nourishment, not just for his body, but for the part of him that had been starving for stability. He ate in silence, then looked down at the journal. After that initial sentence, "I am here," he wrote more. This time, the words tumbled out in a steady stream. "I've been fighting the sensation that I'm failing. I've let that fear keep me from moving. Today, the forest taught me that staying in place is painful in its own way. But when I stood up, if only to cook, I felt the world open. I don't need to climb every mountain at once. One step can be enough." The sun dipped below the high granite walls, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple. He drank in the changing colors, letting them wash over him like a lullaby. The flurry of emotions he had carried into this place seemed to melt into a deep sense of contentment. He decided to make a small fire to keep him company. As night fully descended, he gathered kindling and a few larger pieces of wood, building a careful structure. Striking the match, he found a surprising confidence in that spark. The flames caught, and soon, the fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the early night sky. Every pop and hiss felt like another piece of tension leaving his body. Darkness came quickly in Yosemite, the imposing granite cliffs blotting out the final traces of twilight. Above, a canopy of stars unfurled. It was the sight Bear had longed to see, glittering constellations in a black velvet sky, the faint band of the Milky Way overhead. It reminded him that even in the vastness of existence, there was a place for him. Bear leaned closer to the fire's warmth. He stretched out his feet, rotating his ankles to ease the stiffness from so many hours of sitting. As the firelight flickered, he felt a presence, a gentle sense of communion with the night. He looked toward the trees. Earlier, they had stood guard, silent witnesses to his restless day. Now, they rustled in a gentle breeze, as if telling him it was okay to be uncertain. The forest accepted him, doubts and all. He thought of his mother, who had encouraged him in every endeavor when he was a child. She would have told him it was all right to take his time. She had once said, "Growth isn't a straight line, Elias. It's a winding path. and sometimes the only thing that matters is that you keep walking. Bear closed his eyes and listened to the forest. The slow breath of the wind through the pines felt alive. The Merced River, though out of sight, offered a background murmur that reminded him this land was in constant motion. He spent the next hour filling his journal's pages with everything that had weighed him down, every fear, every regret. It was cathartic. He realized he had carried these burdens so long that they shaped his perception of who he was. But out here, under a dome of cosmic light, with the granite monoliths as silent witnesses, he could finally let them go. Sometime past midnight, the fire dwindled to glowing coals. Bear felt sleep tug at him. He crawled into his tent with a hushed reverence for the moment. The quiet of the forest now brought him comfort instead of dread. Zipping the tent behind him, he realized just how exhausted he was, mentally and physically. Today had been a peculiar day. One part reflection, one part struggle, ending in an evening of acceptance. Before he sank into sleep, Bear smiled to himself. He knew that in the morning, he wouldn't spend hours paralyzed outside the tent. He had bridged some internal gap today, a small but significant victory. The next morning, the dawn light returned, revealing Yosemite's majesty in bold strokes of gold and lavender. Bear woke with a clarity he had not felt in months. Outside, the first calls of jays rang in the fresh air. He glanced at his watch. 6:27 a.m., earlier than he usually woke. Yet he felt restless in a different sense, an eagerness to greet the day. He boiled water for coffee, this time stepping away from the tent without hesitation. As he poured the steaming liquid into his tin mug, he caught sight of Half Dome in the distance, crowned with the pale color of dawn. A single contrail stretched across the sky, reminding him that although he was in this place of deep wildness, the human world was still close. He wasn't running away forever. He was learning to face life with renewed strength. For a moment, he thought back to how he had sat outside his tent for hours yesterday, trapped by an unseen force. He felt gratitude for having gone through that forced stillness. Something in it had pried open a piece of him he had tried too hard to bury. He sipped his coffee hot and slightly bitter and turned toward the sunlight. Yes, today would be different. His gaze followed a narrow path that led deeper into the forest, eventually connecting to the trails that crisscrossed the valley. Maybe he would hike the short loop by Mirror Lake, or perhaps walk a section of the Mist Trail. He didn't have to decide right away. It was enough just to feel the pull of exploration awaken in his veins. After finishing his coffee and tidying up his campsite, Bear shouldered his day pack. The weight felt right, even comforting. Before he left, he paused by his tent, scanning his surroundings with a quiet reverence. This small patch of earth was where he had wrestled with his own mind. It was where he had realized the importance of even the smallest steps. Walking down the winding trail, Bear felt anticipation build with each footfall. The gentle wind carried the scent of pine needles and the faint musk of damp earth. He flexed his fingers, as if he had shed old skin and was ready to touch the world anew. Dappled sunlight played across the path, and the gentle hush of the forest filled him with an awe that nearly brought him to tears. He reflected on all the ways he had isolated himself these last few months, how he had put emotional distance between himself and his closest friends, how he had insisted on bearing his burdens alone. Now he realized that solitude could heal, but it could also become a prison if he let fear bar the door. Yesterday's vigil outside his tent had become a mirror, reflecting that fear back at him. By daring to stand and light the stove, by daring to step forward, he had cracked the spell. As the trail veered toward the river, Bear spotted a fallen log where he decided to rest. The clear water meandered just a few feet away, shimmering in the mid-morning sun. He set his pack down, pulled out his camera, and snapped a photo of the river's gentle bend, capturing the interplay of light and shadow among the rocks. He realized he wanted to share this moment with someone, Fiddling with his phone, surprisingly still within range for a bit of signal, he snapped another photo, his boots propped on the log, the river glinting in the background, the towering pines framing it all. He texted it to his friend Cass, who he had been ignoring for weeks. "Wish you were here. I'm learning a lot about myself in these woods." He clicked send and felt a small tremor of relief. Reaching out to a friend was another step forward. He thought of all the people who cared for him, from college buddies to his mother, waiting for him back in that other reality. Resilience, he realized, wasn't about facing your demons alone. It was about trusting that you could step into the unknown and still be held by the love and support of those around you. Bear got up, slung his pack onto his shoulders, and continued along the trail. The forest parted to reveal a broad meadow washed in bright sunlight. Tender grass bent beneath a gentle wind, a sea of green rippling like waves. He paused to drink in the scene, this tapestry of nature's grandeur. Birds skittered in the brush. A deer grazed in the far corner, lifting her head every so often as if to take note of him. He moved quietly, wanting to keep the animals at peace. His mind drifted to a conversation he'd once overheard between two park rangers about how every living thing here is intricately connected, from the smallest insect to the mightiest conifer. He felt that connectedness now. "I am part of something larger," he thought, "as the forest is part of me." Walking onward, Bear noticed how each breath came easier. In place of the suffocating anxiety, he felt a stirring of hope and curiosity. The day was now bright, the sun well above the cliffs. He considered how quickly the morning had passed, how his earlier dread just yesterday seemed like a distant memory. He realized that, in an unhurried moment of clarity, he had found a crucial truth. Change didn't have to be dramatic to be real. The smallest shift, rising from a stool, cooking a meal, stepping onto a trail, had opened the gateway to transformation. He remembered a quote from John Muir, whose spirit lived in every corner of Yosemite. Between every two pine trees, there is a door leading to a new way of life. Bear felt as though he had finally walked through that door. At a fork in the trail, he paused, checking a small map. One way led to Mirror Lake, the other branched toward Vernal Fall. The old bear would have demanded more of himself, insisted he conquer the toughest trail. But he was discovering a gentler way, guided by his gut feeling rather than the relentless drive to prove himself. He chose the shorter path toward Mirror Lake, feeling a calm energy coaxing him forward. He was unhurried. The meltdown of his tensions the day before had taught him the value of surrender, of letting the forest guide him. Upon arriving at Mirror Lake, Bear found it nearly still, a perfect reflection of the granite walls surrounding it. A hush seemed to cradle the place, the only sound the quiet trickle of water and the distant hush of wind. He set his pack against a rock and took out his camera once more. The reflection in the lake, the synergy of sky and stone, captured his heart. He thought of how he, too, was striving for reflection in his life. Being in nature allowed him to see the flickers of courage within, the light trying to push through the clouds of worry. Just as the lake mirrored the world above, Bear was beginning to mirror the quiet resilience of this land. Seated at the lakeshore, he ran his fingers over the battered cover of his journal. He opened to a fresh page and wrote, "I sat outside my tent for hours. Fear held me there, but in that stillness, I discovered the power of small steps. I stood up, lit my stove, wrote in my journal, and found the courage to speak with my own heart again. Nature showed me the path, but I had to choose to walk it. And I did. When I finally stepped out, everything changed." A gentle breeze ruffled the edges of the page, and he smiled at the parallel between the words he had penned and the reflection on the lake. He understood that clarity didn't come from ignoring your fears. It came from naming them, then pushing past them one breath at a time. He realized he wasn't fixed. That wasn't the point. Growth meant acknowledging he might struggle again, but that he was building the tools to rise, no matter how many times he stumbled. Bear rose to his feet and closed his journal with care, feeling a surge of quiet pride. He lingered a while longer by the lake, breathing in the pine-scented wind, letting nature's wisdom seep into him. Eventually, he started back toward camp, with a new lightness in his step. Back at the campsite, as dusk approached once more, Bear prepared for his final night in the park. He cooked a hearty meal over the stove pasta with tomato sauce, sprinkled with a bit of dried oregano he'd packed. The flavors felt more vibrant than any gourmet feast he'd had in the city, perhaps because they were steeped in the day's healing. When darkness descended, he made another small fire, its dancing flames illuminating the trees. The forest again reminded him it was alive with night songs, but this time there was no edge of fear. He sat close to the fire and felt gratitude welling up. Tomorrow, he would pack up the tent and head back to the life that waited beyond Yosemite's embrace. But he wouldn't be returning as the same person who had arrived. He thought of the man who had sat outside his tent for hours, paralyzed by anxiety. That man was also me, he acknowledged. It was important to remember. He would face new challenges, new doubts, but the memory of stepping out of that paralysis would be the bedrock of his resilience. Bear fed another small log to the flames and watched sparks dance upward. He breathed in, slowly, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. I am here, he thought again, and I am alive. A simple truth, but one that carried immeasurable power. He gazed up, letting his eyes trace the constellations. A shooting star streaked by, a glowing testament to the fleeting beauty of existence. In that moment, Bear silently made a wish to keep walking, to keep trusting, to keep listening to the silent wisdom that nature so generously offered. Tomorrow, he would leave, but the forest would remain, the same way it always had. And in his heart, he believed a piece of that forest, its steadfastness, its cycles of renewal would travel with him, reminding him that change and growth were always possible. He closed his eyes, letting the fire's glow lull him. When he finally drifted to sleep in his tent, it was with a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth, a contentment that he had not felt in a very long time. He had arrived searching for answers. In the end, Yosemite had given him a gentle nudge. Step out of your fear. Let the forest teach you how to stand in your own courage. And remember that resilience is built one moment at a time. Indeed, Bear had sat outside his tent for hours, weighed down by doubt and fear. But the moment he found the strength to stand and walk beyond that small circle of confinement, everything changed. And for that gift of self-discovery, he would forever be grateful.